All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nicky will be doing our 2024 complete SEC conference predictions. We're going to look at the awards, the all-conference teams, and we'll touch about the teams at the... Damn, I don't even have my answer ready. What am I trying to say? Ready?
Yep.
All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nicky are doing our complete 2024 SEC full predictions. We're going to start with the awards and the all-conference teams, and then we'll move to the full standings with the prediction for who will claim this conference. Timestamps below if you'd like to skip around. Looking at the awards, Nick, obviously some pretty interesting omissions here with Jalen Milroe and Kalen DeBoer proving to be a perfect pairing, at least in our eyes, leading to them being able to take home Coach of the Year and Offensive Player of the Year. And I think Deone Walker and James Pierce, both are players that we're incredibly high on. We went ahead and went opposite directions in terms of Player of the Year on that side of the ball. I mainly want to touch, though, on our breakout players of the year, Nick. Two great wide receivers. I think Eugene Wilson will be, an immense producer for Florida. Moose Muhammad, an incredibly underrated talent for Texas A&M. And Suntarine Perkins, the linebacker for Ole Miss, getting the nod from both of us. Just a guy who was a former five-star, a tremendous athlete who made his presence felt at times last year. Looking at these awards, which one are you most confident with being a lock?
I like Moose Muhammad to be a breakout player of the year on offense. We've been kind of waiting for him to show up, a really highly rated player out of high school. Went to A&M, didn't really have much success early on in his tenure there. I think he's a really talented player top to bottom who is a really solid wide receiver. He has a good frame, nice speed on him, a guy that I think could really break out this year as A&M kind of transitions here under a new head coaching staff with Mike Elko and company taking over. Muhammad didn't have the best season last year. At times, he looked solid, but we're really waiting for him to break out. He had 345 yards receiving last year and 2 scores. I think he can get to 10 touchdowns this year and, push a lot higher in his reception number as well, or receiving yards, that is. I like Moose Muhammad a lot there. I do like us also going with the Bama duo at Offensive Player of the Year and Coach of the Year. I think this is a match made in heaven here for this Alabama Crimson Tide offense. Jalen Milroe looks to capitalize, continue to develop as a star quarterback.
And looking at the newcomer of the year, obviously this is a conference that hoards a lot of talent when it comes to the portal, and obviously when it comes to recruiting. I'm going to go ahead and go with Caden Green, though. Likely to play guard after the addition of Marcus Bryant, but I think if he does play tackle regardless, he's going to be a massive impact for them on that left side. And you went with a guy that not a lot of people know of, Anton Jukaj from Arkansas, is coming over from Albany. You're hoping he can have a Jared Verse-like impact coming from that same school. Why did you end up settling on him out of all players, though?
I ended up setting with him because I think he can be that Jared Verse type player. I watched the film at Albany. It looks similar to what we saw out of Verse when he transferred to Florida State and had an immediate impact, became a star player for the Seminoles. I think this makes a lot of sense. I think he's a very talented player out of upstate New York coming down here to Arkansas. They need pass rush help. They need to get after the quarterback this year if they want to have any sort of success. And Sam Pittman, as his seat is very hot, and I think this is a guy that could really step up and be a dominant force on that edge there, getting off the right or left side. Very versatile player, has a lot of room to grow, and could be a really nice star player in the SEC.
And then, of course, at the bottom of our screen, our biggest sleepers. We're going to touch on them later on in the show. Looking at the all-conference first team for the SEC, I think Trevor Etienne this year is going to be, a bit of a bell cow running back for Georgia. Something you typically don't see is, guys getting, a big giant bulk of carries. I think Etienne will certainly get that nod for the Bulldogs this year. Biggest guy that we're going to focus on here, Will Campbell, Nick. This guy looks like from LSU is going to be the top tackle in the country this season, a player who shows great hands, great power and athletic ability, allowed 0 sacks this past season, 6'6", 320. And I think where he struggles most will be, losing hand fights. His initial punch doesn't always land, and that's where he certainly starts to get behind. I think you're going to see him take a big step forward in that area. This is going to be a great player this year, Nick. Again, no sacks allowed last year. For a guy who's returning to college football, this guy seems to be the limit for Will Campbell.
Will Campbell's an absolute star player on the offensive line. I do want to just highlight that this is a very diverse and deep conference with talent. There are 6 teams represented here on this all-conference offensive list for us, which is a really impressive number considering how much talent is across the board at some of the top schools as well. In the past, you've seen Alabama and Georgia dominate these sort of preseason all-conference awards with their offense or defenses respectively. But now we got 6 different teams here with the addition of Texas adding 2 players in Banks and Baxter, who are really 2 solid players, as well as Jake Majors from Texas as well, a 3rd player they add to this list. So I think this is a very diverse and deep list. This offense, all-conference offense, has a lot of solid players that are going to be key contributors for their teams.
That includes 2 pass catchers from Lane Kiffin's Ole Miss offense. Looking at the all-conference defense, Michael Williams, a guy I really expected to emerge last year, didn't quite do it. I think he's certainly in line to do so. And you look at the other guys here on the D-line, I mean, just incredibly stacked, including our 2 players of the year. James Pierce, Nick, I know a guy that you're certainly incredibly high on, as is everybody else. I think Harold Perkins, he's going to remind everyone who he is this upcoming season. Deontay Lawson from Alabama, I think, is going to have a big year. Seems like a guy that's probably not going to get named to a lot of all-conference first teams this offseason. I think he's certainly going to be in contention to do so, and I think the safety positions are pretty much locked up. Malachi Moore and Malachi Starks from Alabama and Georgia. Pretty straightforward here. You alluded to Texas getting 3 on the first offense, and then I think they're going to get Anthony Hill on defense, so a former 5-star who's immensely going to break out this season.
You had some variety here by adding 2 solid players in Walker and Harston from from Kentucky. That is 2 really solid players. I think Walker, is such an incredibly talented player. Can certainly see why you picked him to be your defensive player of the year. I went with James Pierce, who I think will be the best defensive player, the first defensive player taken off the board in the 2025 draft, if not the first overall player in the entire draft. There's certainly a possibility that happens. He's a really talented player that returns double-digit tackle for loss and sacks last year for Pierce. He's going to be an absolute home wrecker for Tennessee, a really incredible player to have on that edge. I think Deontay Lawson, Harold Perkins are 2 players to watch as well. Very exciting players. Will Perkins be more comfortable? We saw him get a lot more comfortable at the second half of the season, played a more natural role, and really sort of developed into that role. Lawson, a guy primed to step up, having to replace some talent gone there. I think Lawson has a fantastic defensive coordinator now, a former head coach of South Alabama that steps up to the Crimson Tide as their DC. That could be a really nice pairing there as well. I think this list is very solid. A lot of really good players here. A lot of familiar faces, guys that have been around the conference for a little bit now, like Starks, Moore, and more as well. Guys that are a bit veteran to this conference, are really solid all-conference defense team here.
Now, looking at our 2024 SEC standings predictions, we went ahead and already broke all these teams down in full already on the podcast. So if you're looking for a certain one, just go there and you'll be able to find it. Full in-depth preview. So we're just going to be focused on really on one topic regarding each team. And we start with Alabama, Nick. Obviously, a lot of people are probably going to be shocked to see 12-0 with the Crimson Tide's name. And the thing for me is a lot of people are only focusing on the negatives, and I think that's certainly the mental toughness that comes with DeBoer, transitioning to the SEC, in-game adjustments. I think recruiting was a big one that's certainly being answered currently. But turning to stuff on the field, though, when you lose Nick Saban, the ability to coach the defensive backs, discipline, physicality, some of those things were certainly kind of going out the window, Nick, especially discipline under Nick Saban. The people aren't alluding to were the last couple of years, they've just been horrendous when it comes to penalties. The offensive line has been bad when it comes to allowing sacks and even, getting a push up front. And that seems to be the only negatives that we're talking about. And again, I think some of those things were already kind of on their way out. And I think DeBoer here is going to bring some freshness, a nice young guy who's had immense success as a head coach. And I think the positives include, Jalen Milroe, a guy who was, a quarterback with a lot of upside, of a big-time arm. I think can certainly thrive with a QB coach of his nature. Kind of similar to that of Michael Penix, right? So I think the development is certainly there. And another thing people aren't talking about is this roster is still incredibly talented. Anywhere you look, they are just absolutely loaded. The offensive line has 3 guys that could potentially go early in the NFL draft next year, and that includes Parker Brailsford, who came over. You look at Jaden Roberts, Tyler Booker as well. The edge rushing department is another key area, I think, for Alabama, where they have immense talent. Guys like Yontez Pierre, Keon Keeley, Q Rasaw. I mean, these guys are all 5-stars, Nick, and you look into their secondary currently, you look the return of Moore, Keon Sabb was great for Michigan, and everyone else, Xavier Brown, Xavier Mincy, some of these incoming guys, Jalen Mwagbi, these guys are all 5-star talents. It's everywhere you look, Nick. They didn't lose that much in the portal one bit. This is still an incredibly talented roster, and nobody really seems to have the right read like I just explained on Alabama, and I think that's why they're certainly going to be able to shock teams this season.
It seems like people are sleeping on Alabama, which is a weird thing to say considering the Crimson Tide dominated college football for the better part of 15 years under Nick Saban. He retires, and yes, it's natural to expect a fall off of some sort of quality. But like you alluded to, that some of the discipline issues had really been showing up in the past 3 or 4 years. Remember the game at Texas, tons of penalties in that game. The game at Tennessee, tons of penalties in that game. Even go back to 2019, tons of bad discipline penalties against Auburn and a loss on the road, including an offsides on a 4th down that gave basically iced the game for Auburn, a completely bad miscue that it was not non-traditional of Alabama. Things like that over the last 5 years or so have really been starting to show up in Tuscaloosa. And now you're bringing a fresh face into DeBoer, who has a fantastic winning record, took a team in Washington to the College Football National Championship last year, won the Pac-12 with them. A lot of people picked Oregon to win that game in the Pac-12 title game. They went out and won that game in Vegas and played a really solid day. When they were doubted, a lot of people picked Texas to win the game in the Sugar Bowl. They went out there and won that game as well. So DeBoer can seriously coach. He's a really fantastic player. The recruiting has worked out for him so far as well. A really great recruiter, it seems, on the trail. He's really got some nice ads. For Alabama, who people predicted there'd be a fall off in recruiting with Hugh Freeze on the other side of the state, Kirby Smart just across the border in Georgia. But DeBoer has been able to bring in talent top to bottom and sort of continue to keep this thing churning. This team is very talented, very deep. I think the offense is very deep. The defense has some nice rotational pieces. The coaching staff they put together, I think, is really solid. They missed a little bit on the offensive coordinator, but the guy they plugged in there, I think, will be solid. And then I previously mentioned the defensive coordinator, former head coach at South Alabama. Anytime you can poach a head coach to be a coordinator at your program, that's an incredible add, in my opinion, no matter how you chalk it up. It's a great thing to do, get that sort of experience and leadership in the locker room from a coaching perspective. I think Alabama are primed to still be in a great position. I don't think the Crimson Tide are going anywhere, despite what some people on social media hope and desire after Nick Saban retired. This is still a very deep team, top to bottom, that should have a great year under Kalen DeBoer's first year in Tuscaloosa.
And looking at the Georgia Bulldogs, I have their own loss in the regular season, coming to the hands of Alabama, going on the road there early on in the year in Tuscaloosa and losing. And you can certainly focus on two things, the left and right tackle positions for the Bulldogs, or you can look at the defensive line and the run defense. Take a bit of a step back last year. It was nothing egregious, right? Never costed them a game. They were 20th nationally against the run, but we're typically seeing them, top three. I think it was 4 years in a row against the run. So seeing them step back a little bit is certainly something you want to address. But this is a defensive line that, despite not having really, a Jordan Davis or a Trayvon Walker, an elite first-round prospect, they still have great players. A great duo in Warren Brinson and Nazir Stackhouse. They're both, 300-plus pounds. Michael Williams, a guy who has great speed, the power, a nice bull rusher, really stands up and walks down opposing offensive linemen. That is, you certainly want to see him emerge from his defensive end spot this season. There's not much turnover up front here on this defensive line. They do have guys showing up, though, they're going to make big impacts. A five-star Jordan Hall enters his second year. Jamal Jarrett's a 350-pounder who was a top 100 recruit last year. I think they're happy with Christian Miller as well. Tyrion Ingram Dawkins is a former five-star who hasn't exactly lived up to his talent, but is still a rotational guy who has some great length. This defensive line, again, doesn't have an elite standout that you can pencil in as a first round, but this is a great group of players here. One of the nation's best defensive fronts. I think the linebacking core, some younger guys being in there when Dumas Johnson went down certainly wasn't great. Smail Munden returns alongside C.J. Allen, who I think is going to do great this year. And I'm a phenomenal fan of Jalen Walker. I think this is a guy with great speed and suddenness off the edge. They're certainly going to get him involved in one way or another, probably more as a pass rusher than a run stopper. But you've seen it at times last year, Nick. This Georgia run defense wasn't very good. Florida had some success against them. Tennessee obviously had a big run to start the game. They went 75 yards to the house. Georgia Tech had 200-plus yards. Missouri, especially getting to the edge, did pretty well. They ran for 150 in that game. And then Auburn, of course, they had 200-plus yards. That was a game they really didn't look good in against the run. And again, they never got costed in any of these contests, but a couple of the games I listed off, Nick, were one-score games that certainly could have went either direction. And obviously, they played great the last two games of the year against Bama and FSU in the trenches. But if they were to take another step back, it could certainly cause for concern. I don't think it will, though. This isn't a phenomenal defensive line, though. What do you make of it?
Obviously, if we're talking about this defense saying they step back and they're still a top 20 run defense in the country, that's a pretty high standard that Kirby Smart has set out there in Athens, and that's exactly what it is. It's a high standard. He gave 113 yards per game on the ground last year, which is uncharacteristic for this Kirby Smart defense. They were not exactly what you would hoped out of them. They had some tough times. That Auburn game in particular is one I look at and I'm like, wow, I can't believe Auburn was able to absolutely dash and torch them on the ground, considering Auburn was really not a great team on the ground last year. They had two good games against, coincidentally, Georgia and Alabama at home. Outside of that, they really struggled on the ground, and they really found their groove in that game early in the season against Georgia. I think there are some really solid players they return. I think Stackhouse and Brinson in that middle there are really good players. Michael Williams, you're very high on him this year. I'm not as high on him, but I think he does have potential to step up and be a solid player. C.J. Allen, Smail Munden, two really good players against the run who we need to see more of this year. Ingram Dawkins as well. What is he going to look like? Is he going to be able to fully step up? I think this run defense will find itself to a similar form. I don't think it's going to take a step back at all. I think it's going to be at a similar level, if not better. But if you're a Georgia fan, you want to see this run defense get back to that dominating levels that they had 2-3 years ago when they won those national championships back to back. It just wasn't there last year. It didn't cost them, but you can only test your luck so often before it does finally cost you. They may make a mistake and lose a game potentially to Alabama early in the year if the run defense isn't holding up, and Jalen Milroe and that running back room is able to run all over them in Tuscaloosa. Certainly could be something to keep an eye on this year.
Looking at the Texas Longhorns, I have them losing at home to Georgia. And then, obviously the neutral site game against Oklahoma that could certainly go any direction. The biggest thing for Texas, they lose a lot of production in the supporting cast. They lose their, top four, really top five pass catchers, if you want to include Jonathan Brooks, who was just a phenomenal runner for them. And obviously when he went down, nobody was really worried. We figured that they had a deep enough backfield to offset his loss. CJ Baxter, Jaden Blue really stepped up, and I expect that to continue this season. But the wide receiver group you certainly want to allude to. Xavier Worthy, obviously elite speed's gone. A.D. Mitchell, this route running, he played very well against some phenomenal corners last year. And they replaced it with three transfers. Isaiah Bond from Alabama comes over with great body control. Only had 2 drops last season. He was a great deep threat for the Tide. Seemed to just run past defenses often. Probably doesn't have the same twitch as Worthy. He's a bit bigger at 182 pounds as well. But Bond is certainly going to be a guy they expect to be a 1,200-yard pass catcher. Cialis Bolden, the guy who's greatly undersized, 5'8", 157. That comes with elite quickness. He's got pure burner speed. I love the change of direction. He can win out wide as an X as well. He's got good coordination to locate the football. And they're bringing in Matthew Golden, with some versatility from Houston. He's mainly an outside wide receiver. His best game, coincidentally, last year for the Cougars came against Texas in what was a much closer game than it should have been. I think you look at a guy like Jonte Cook, who I think is going to be phenomenal, high-end 5-star from last year. He has, good ball tracking and body control. DeAndre Moore, Ryan Wingo, Ryan Niblett. Some high-end recruits they're expected to get involved here. And even Amari Nyblack, another transfer they picked up, who will probably, have some solid production as a tight end for them. What do you think of this entire really supporting cast, Nick? Because again, they lose their top 5 pass catchers and their leading rusher, who was elite. But the guys they replace them with, I think, are very good, and their creativity here is certainly going to be something of note.
Texas certainly loses a lot of talent, which is certain. You got to take a note of that, right? They do lose a lot of talent around what Quinn Ewers looks to be, potentially another breakout season for him. But I do think they have a lot of players that they got in the portal that could really work out. Plus, those high-level recruits and younger guys you talked about. I think Golden's a really good ad at the wide receiver H, a really solid player at Houston who comes over, stays in state, could be a really good ad. Isaiah Bond, Alabama legend for his heroics against Auburn in the past, a really solid player top to bottom in that Z, a very versatile and flexible wide receiver that can do a whole lot for you. Nyblack, another Crimson Tide transfer at tight end, not really a traditional tight end, but can't really be a wide receiver either, kind of stuck in that no man's land middle role there. They're going to play him and Gunnar Helm at tight end. Those two, I think, are solid. That's a nice rotational there. CJ Baxter, you return him at running back. Baxter had a really good year last year. Baxter can step up and be a star this year, in my opinion. He had 659 yards on the ground and 5 scores. I think he can get to 1,000 yards easily this year. I know they have to replace Jonathan Brooks, who had over 1,000 yards on the ground prior to his injury. I'm not as concerned. I think Jonte Cook is going to step up this year. Ryan Wingo, Parker Livingston, Aaron Butler, Ryan Niblett, all really young players who have a lot of potential to step up and be very talented star wide receivers for the Texas program. I'm not super concerned about it. I think there is enough depth for them to figure out and have this offense clicking to its full potential.
Now look at another team that's going to go 10-2, at least according to our predictions. Ole Miss, their only 2 losses last year came to Bama and Georgia. Everything seems perfect for Lane Kiffin, Nick. They have a quarterback entering his 3rd year in the system, and Jackson Dart, incredibly loaded backfield, despite losing Quinshad Judkins. Guys like Logan Diggs come over to make everything better. Rashad Amos, Trey Harris, Jordan Watkins, added on Juice Wells to the receiving corps. They're absolutely loaded on offense. Defensive side of the ball has shown great progressions with Pete Golding on that side. Bringing in Walter Nolan, Princeton Unimanellan, certainly great when they get guys like Jared Ivey and J.J. Pegues back. Everything seems perfect for Ole Miss, Nick, but the trenches, they obviously gave up 300 yards rushing to Georgia last year. I think they're going to be much better with those additions. The main thing I want to focus on is this offensive line. I think it was On 3 the other day. I seen them have Ole Miss as a top 10 offensive line. I don't know where you're getting that from. This is just not a unit that played up to par to be getting those type of standards. Obviously they get guys back like Micah Pettis. Diego Pons comes over, a 330-pound player who was a good, pass blocker at his last school. They picked up some guys from Washington that are certainly going to be good. It was a great offensive line for them. Picking up, those guys for them on the interior is certainly of note. Jeremy James is a good player for them. Gurkhan Squat, a 340-pound player they picked up from USM. This is certainly an offensive line that they were just absolutely beat last season, Nick, in those 2 losses against 2 physical teams on the defensive side of the ball against Georgia and Alabama. They were no good one bit. They weren't good against Penn State. They weren't good against Auburn. And they're hoping guys like Nate Colepto and Julius Buelow from Washington can be big-time additions there at the guard spots. But those 2 players were the weak links of that, award-winning offensive line that were not great. Those 2 players, that being, were not good against Michigan. I just don't know where we're getting this notion that this is a top 10 offensive line. Even against Texas A&M, I thought they struggled a good bit. What do you make of this unit, Nick? Because I think the potential is there, but the additions they make, even though it is a lot of new size and some new talent, do you think it's enough to overcome the deficiencies, or do you think this O-line will eventually hold them back?
I share your similar concern with this offensive line. I think this is the one thing that could put this team back, right? This is a unit that they've worked on. They added solid players in Pounds, Calippo, and Julius Blow from various schools, including the two guys from Washington that were part of that national championship team. But they were the two weakest links on that Washington offense. I think Caleb Warren is a really solid player. I think Micah Pettis, he can step up at right tackle this year and evolve as a player. They have some solid depth. But I think this is a unit that's very weak compared to other in the SEC. They didn't bring in enough talent, in my opinion. They didn't get the quite amount of players they needed. And this could be something that you can lose the battle. If your quarterback, Jackson Dart, has no time in the backfield, if he's getting pressured early on and he stumbles and he really can't find a way to be comfortable in the pocket, this offense is going to struggle and they're going to have some mistakes. You got to build in the trenches. That's the first thing, the key thing in the SEC. That's the reason why Ole Miss keeps losing to Alabama, Georgia, teams like that are just more physical and win the battle in the trenches. Ole Miss made some nice progress, but I think it's definitely the weakest point of this team. This offensive line definitely worries me, and it could be a cause for concern as the season goes on.
Now you look at the Missouri Tigers, a team that certainly delivered on expectations last year that we had for them to just be able to compete and be a sleeper in that conference. That's exactly what they did. And a lot of people didn't show them respect. We certainly did. We're glad to see Eli Drinkwitz doing well. I think Missouri, you got to look at them as potentially having the nation's best wide receiver core led by Luther Burden. They finally put him in the slot as a mainstay last year. It led to great production. Allowed him to get more free releases. They used him on screens. Got him in the open space, and he cooked. Good contested catch ability. It was great in the red zone. The slot fade was beautiful for him. Luther Burden just probably going to be the nation's top receiver this year. Add with Theo Weiss, a guy who showcased great hands, only had one drop, kind of resurrected his career after a disappointing run in Norman. Was really good at tracking the ball and go routes. Plenty of outside curls. I think he showed some nice pop and run and catch situations. Mookie Cooper, 500 yards as a number 3 is pretty sound. He's usually going to be in the slot or a quiet Z pass catcher. No touchdowns in 2 years, though. Certainly wants to change that notion. And Mekhi Miller, a guy the staff is still incredibly high on as an under-the-radar playmaker. This is a great receiving core. They can get everybody back, Nick. There's pretty much no production that they lose here. They even get back Brett Norfleet at tight end, who was really good in the final few games of the season. But not only do they have a great receiving core, but I think what they did in the portal was great. They obviously lose a phenomenal rusher, a 1,600-yard rusher at that. And they replaced him with Marcus Carroll and Nate Noel, some nice transfers from the group of 5 level, from the Sun Belt, that is. And then another concern with them was their left side of their offensive line. What would they do replacing 2 bookends of there? Caden Green comes over from Oklahoma, of course, my newcomer of the year in this conference. And then Marcus Bryant, a guy who was just phenomenal at SMU the past couple of seasons. They're probably going to slot him in at left tackle. Missouri's did a great job, Nick, not just with this receiving core, but the issues they had in terms of losses. They were able to go fill them with ease in the portal, and I think this is just phenomenal work from the staff.
This is the nation's best wide receiving room, in my opinion, and it really starts with the headliner, Luther Burden, right? An in-state guy that they won, Eli Drinkwitz. There's a lot of talk about whether or not he could recruit, whether or not he could bring talent in, and he's been winning the battle in-state. I know Missouri is not the most talent-rich state in the country, but there are some solid players, such as Burden and some other defensive players they've gotten, and he's been winning that battle. Eli Drinkwitz has been getting guys to commit to Missouri, stay home. Burden was looking at Georgia, looking at some of the other top schools in the SEC, and he got him to stay home here, and it's been working out. We questioned whether or not he would stay or he would transfer. He's going to stay for 1 year and transfer. They didn't really use him a whole lot in that first year, and we were worried that would mean, he might hit the portal, might be bolting for the exit, but he stuck around. He got used in his proper position. They moved him around a little bit his freshman year, and they moved him to the wide receiver H this year, and it worked out great. 1,200 yards receiving, 14.1 yards per grab, and 9 scores for Burden, who is the best wide receiver in the country. Such a talented player. Another year of him working with his quarterback Brady Cook, who returns and looked really solid last year. Certainly bodes well for this offense. Theo Weiss returns. Weiss, it didn't really work out for him at Oklahoma. They brought him in, and he looked comfortable last year. 682 yards receiving and 6 scores for him. I like to see him get the double figures and 1,000 yards receiving this year. I think it's certainly possible for Weiss, who's a really solid player. Mookie Cooper hasn't scored yet, but he's got about 500 yards receiving, a really solid depth rotational piece. Yes, they lost Cody Schrader, who is a big loss, but I think the 2 guys they added, especially Nate Noel from App State and then Marcus Carroll from Georgia State, 2 really good Sunbelt adds. I think Nate Noel can really take over the reins and be the number 1 back here, really can carry the load, get close to 1,200 yards on the ground. I'm really excited to see what he can do this year.
Now I look at the Tennessee Volunteers. A soft schedule allows them to go 9-3, but I think they have a guy at quarterback, Nico Lamaliva, who could potentially be a volunteer Heisman candidate. Obviously, Hendon Hooker, I think, ended up winning the fan vote for the Heisman a couple years back. Joe Milton was expected to be in the running for that. Wasn't quite as good, but But this guy right here is the real deal, a real athletic player for me, and 6'6", 205, a capable off-platform thrower, great live arm, the ability to make some good throws on the run. Has a nice quick 3-step drop. The thing about him is he has great velocity on his throws to the boundary. Quick throws on curls, comebacks, patented routes of this scheme. He threw them all with great accuracy, at least I've seen on tape. Just the ball placement is phenomenal. Has great escapability. Nice scrambler. Has great speed as well. He's a major weapon in the red zone. Had 3 rushing touchdowns in the bowl game. You certainly want to see how he does in road games. His pre-snap recognition abilities versus tough defenses. How will they translate? And I think overall they're going to translate well. It's hard to imagine him not having a breakout 4,000-yard season. But again, it's not going to be perfect, Nick. It never works out like that. But I think for Tennessee, you're incredibly happy with this guy at quarterback, a player you thought probably should have been on the field a season ago.
Quarterback, they're going to plug in a guy that can be a really talented player. Last year, I was not very high on Joe Milton. I thought he was going to hold back this offense. I thought he was going to be, the problem for this Tennessee offense. A lot of Tennessee fans, a lot of college football fans in general disagreed. You and I were both early on that. We felt Milton had great arm potential, but really was lacking some of those mechanics. And now Nico steps in as a true 5-star, the highest ranked quarterback recruit really since Peyton Manning in this part of town. So now you plug him in there. He's got a great frame, really solid arm strength, really good field vision. Looked good in the bowl game, albeit against Iowa. Did look good in that game, looked comfortable in the pocket, really did have a nice day down there in the bowl game. I think he's got a lot of potential to grow as a quarterback. I think he'd really be a star in the SEC, potentially a top 5 quarterback in the conference by the end of the season if he's not already there in some people's book. Like I said, love the frame, love the arm. I think the field vision is good. The footwork is solid as well. Has a nice, supporting cast with Brew McCoy and Squirrel White. Sky's the limit. I think Heisman certainly is in the possibility for him, if not this year, in the future.
And that was the top half of our standings predictions. Looking at the bottom half, the rest of the conference, I think all these teams can be a sleeper in a sense. That's just how good the SEC is. Auburn sitting at 8-4. I think it'll be a good year for Hugh Freeze, adding Derek Nix as the OC, bringing in Cam Coleman. I think shows the dedication to improving the offensive side of the ball, and including other guys like Keandre Lambert-Smith, Dylan Wade in the past in the portal. And the guy's really going to be big this year as he moves to guard. Percy Lewis, they bring him in to be left tackle. So they're doing good portal work. They're also recruiting very well. I think the offensive side of the ball for Auburn is something they're certainly going to continue to improve on. Well, they also have a defense that I think can compete. And again, guys like Jalen McLeod, Kendrick Folk, they've really done a good job of revamping this defense. DJ Durkin has a lot to work with. For Texas A&M, I think this is a team that's incredibly underrated, Nick. Obviously, Mike Elko was the correct hire, A+1 for me. Connor Wigman, a 5-star quarterback. They were able to retain their entire backfield led by Reuben Owens and Le'Veon Moss. The receiving core, you had Moose Muhammad being a big breakout, but he's not the only good one in that core. Jedi Walker, Noah Thomas. Some of the transfer ads are certainly going to make it hard for him to take home any hardware. That's how much competition is there. And I think the defense is still incredibly stout. Guys like Shamar Turner, David Hicks is a guy they landed. This is just a phenomenal roster, I think, still. Theron York, Tyreek Chappelle. I think the secondary for A&M is going to be an incredibly underrated unit. And I think the biggest thing here, Nick, is Florida going 7-5, a complete shocker. I'm the only one this year that's probably going to pick Florida to go above 500. But I've correctly predicted this team's record 2 years in a row, Nick. I got a great read of what's going on in Gainesville. I think the offensive line is going to showcase nice improvements. I think Graham Mertz and, a versatile receiving core with a lot of speed, they're going to continue to be good. But I think more importantly, a defense that had a lot of youth last year is certainly going to start to turn things around this upcoming season. They've also, paid high attention to the trenches. Guys like Cameron Jackson, Joey Slackman, Caleb Banks, they're pretty good on that side of the ball, and they've also recruited very well. The linebacking core is a bit of a concern, but I think the secondary is going to become a strong point for Florida this year after being incredibly weak a year ago. I think Jordan Castell, Jason Marshall, Devin Moore, if he can stay healthy, are really going to lead a bit of a resurgence. 7-5 for me for Florida. I think that included a win over LSU as well. They're also going to beat Miami. What do you make of the Gators going above 500? Something, again, no one else is probably going to say.
You went with 7-5. I went with 5-7, but I don't think both are going to be good enough for Florida fans. They have high expectations for Billy Napier and company down there in Gainesville, and they really seem to be putting the pressure on him. I think they need to give him some time here. He's a really solid recruiter. We've seen that so far. They brought in some solid players, some nice 5-stars they flipped from other states, some talent from inside the state of Florida as well. I think you need to give Billy Napier time. I know Florida fans want to compete for a national championship, but the roster is just not quite there yet. I have them at 5-7, which would certainly put him in the danger zone, but I think this Florida team's still good. I think they have a lot of solid players and a really good home environment. Plus, I like the coaching and the coaching staff in general is really solid. So if Florida, if Florida does go 5-7, that's going to be a disappointment for Gators fans. But I think they're stepping in the right direction. This team could be primed to compete in the SEC in 2-3 years if they stick the course of Napier. In my opinion, I don't think you need go anything crazy, fire him right now. Yes, it's gonna be a tough season. Yes, Florida fans are not gonna be happy with 5-7 from me. They won't be happy with 7-5 from you either. But I think they're starting to build and get something right down there in Gainesville.
Yeah, I think Billy Napier's doing a good job of recruiting. This team, they're fighting, they're competing, and that's really the big thing you want to see this year. You saw it last year with them too. Obviously, with the schedule, everyone's going to pick you to lose every single game, and I understand that, especially with the one they have this season. But those things matter. Playing hard for your team, playing hard for your head coach. Obviously, some of the discipline and some of the decision making has not been great from a team standpoint. Losing to Arkansas is pretty embarrassing. The game against Utah was a disaster in week 1. But they played hard, Nick, against everybody the last 3 weeks. LSU, Missouri, FSU didn't win any of those games. They were in those though, and they put up 30-plus points in 2 of them. So the offense, they showed the ability to be able to hang in those games. So I think Florida's going to be a little bit better than people are giving them credit for this season. And obviously on here are 2 sleeper teams, Nick, Oklahoma and Kentucky. I think Kentucky, this is a team I'm incredibly high on. Only 7 wins though. I think there's potential for a lot more. Bringing over Bush Hadman as the OC with Brock Vandegrift and a receiving core that I love. Berrigan Brown, great speed. Dane Keyes, a great downfield playmaker of his hands and ability to track the ball. Jamori Macklin steps into a role from North Texas, and they have plenty of depth guys who also have tremendous speed. The thing with them, though, is the offensive line might hold them back. The running back room's not very good. I think, they were dead last year in plays. They weren't able to stay on the field very long because they just moved so slow. And I think this year, with a more college-friendly offense, they're going to speed things up, wear down defenses more. And with the speed they have a receiver, it's certainly going to pay dividends for an offense that was very good at sparking big plays. I think for Kentucky, Marcus Stoops, again, Deion Walker, this guy's a freak of nature at defensive tackle. The entire defensive line's great. Octavius Oxendine, Josiah Hayes, Khalil Saunders. These guys are all veterans, have been around a long time. Even Keyshawn Silver at 322 pounds. This is going to be a great run defense. And the linebacking core, J.J. Weaver's back for a 6-year ball. Derek Jackson was great. And they also had a Jayon Dumas Johnson, Nick. And then one more thing about Kentucky is, obviously the secondary might regress a little bit. But Maxwell Harrison was, a guy who was great for them last year, landed on my preseason all-conference team. This is a very good football team, Nick, and obviously I'm doing a lot of hype for them to only go 7-5. Schedule's difficult. They play Georgia week 3 at home. The opportunity in Lexington this year is pretty massive.
Mark Stoops stayed home in Lexington. There were rumors about him going to A&M. I thought that would have been a pretty solid hire if they went, but A&M fans didn't really like it. They ended up getting Mike Elko instead, which is a solid hire for the Aggies as well. Stoops, I think he's comfortable in Lexington. I think this works. Continues to stay there. Brings in Brock Vandegrift, a really solid quarterback. Great arm strength, huge physical frame from Georgia. He could be the key to unlock that offense. I love the deep ball potential there. The defense is very solid for Kentucky. Some really strong players like Walker, who you picked as your defensive player of the year, who's a really good physical player on the defensive line. I like this Kentucky team. The running back room is really the only part that I'm worried about. What is that running back room going to look like? They have to replace some talent. But overall, I think the Wildcats are a really good team. They fall victim to a very tough schedule, which has kind of been the case in several years in the Mark Stoops era. But again, another consistently strong season for Kentucky, in my opinion. 7-5. I think you got to be happy that you're a Wildcats fan.
And now, obviously, the one you focused on was Oklahoma. I picked them to go 7-5. I also picked them to beat Texas. Obviously, that doesn't really go hand in hand, does it? But this is a team that faces an incredibly difficult schedule. They replaced their entire offensive line. And I think that's, perfect timing with Seth Luttrell stepping into the offensive coordinator role, a true air raid guy who's going to tailor this offense to the strengths. And those strengths are, a 5-star quarterback in Jackson Arnold getting the nod and a receiving room that's incredibly deep. Nick Anderson had 21 yards per catch last year. Jaleel Farouk has proven to be a good downfield playmaker for them. Andrew Anthony, had great value. He was a great value play for them early on last year before getting hurt. I think Jaden Gibson, Jaquise Petaway, and even Brendan Thompson. This is an incredibly deep wide receiver core. It also sees Deion Burks come over from Purdue. The defensive side of the ball, though, this is still a work in progress, and they're still going to get there. They were much better against the pass this season ago. Still a lot of big plays. They were able to, snag 20 interceptions. I think, Deshaun McCullough being healthy is going to be big for them. Woody Washington, the returnee for the Sooners, that's nice for them at corner. I like Peyton Bowen's ability at safety. Gentry Williams was a pretty good player for them when he was healthy. This is a secondary I think will continue to improve. But you also look at the run defense and how they will be able to do. I think they're thin on the inside. Dominic Williams, though, might just be the saving grace. I mean, they're very glad to get him back. DeJoun Terry's a good gap clogger. David Stone's a high-end 5-star. And, of course, they get back Ethan Downs to the defensive end position. I don't think this defense will be bad by any means, right, Nick? But I still think they're 1 year behind, even though Danny Stutzman returning is massive for them. I think this year, though, they're going to have some issues against the tougher teams. I think their secondary will have some issues, but I think this offense, they're going to be just fine. Overall, it's just a victim of a tough schedule, really, of Oklahoma, Nick. Having younger players at most positions, I think, will do that to you. And they're going to grow up in front of our eyes, I think, for next year in 2025. They're going to be a great team. Right now, 7-5 for me, but I definitely think this is a big sleeper team, like you're alluding to.
I picked the Sooners as my sleeper team because they're a team that's not getting a whole lot of love. In my opinion, Texas is getting all the love as they enter the conference. Everyone's talking about Texas being a national title contender. Rightly so. They have a very talented team. But Oklahoma has a really nice football history, and they're coming into the conference and really not getting a whole lot of love. I think Brent Venables is the fantastic hire, a really solid coach. And yes, it's been kind of a slow start, but they're kind of figuring it out slowly in Oklahoma. That defense is getting up to level. At the Lincoln Riley era, there was no defense. Now you're putting in a defensive head coach who's trying to focus and figure things out for his defense. I like the direction they're heading. I think Jackson Arnold's a really nice boomer bust prospect. A lot of potential with him. I like the defense returning, Danny Stutzman, some other guys in the middle of the defense. Really solid. A good wide receiving room that has a lot of guys that need to step up, though. Guys we need to see a lot out of. I think the offensive line is a little concerning. Running back room has some potential to develop as well. I have Oklahoma at 7-5, and I think they could certainly get higher than that. It's a tough schedule. Again, fall victim to tough schedule, but they're getting no love at all. I really think they're a sleeper team that could shock a few teams. They travel to Auburn. That could be one they could win. They play Alabama at home late in the season. They could pick off the Crimson Tide potentially. They're a team to keep an eye on this year.
In the bottom feeders of the conference, Vandy, I don't expect anything from them really ever. Mississippi State, Jeff Lebby's going to be a victim of a, roster exodus. And the South Carolina team that's got some intrigue to them. Beamer ball is real. Again, just a team that falls victim to a hard schedule and also being weaker in the trenches. The O-line is really probably not going to be much better. I love the additions they made in the portal, though. Raheem Sanders leads a revamped running back room. Nicholas Harbor, a 5-star in last year's class, is really going to emerge this year alongside Jared Brown, who they got from Coastal Carolina. And, of course, the Lenore Sellers, that quarterback, a guy who seems to have some pretty good upside, who as a young player will probably struggle a good bit this year. I definitely like some of the portal ads they added on defense, though, as well. Kyle Kennard, right in from Georgia Tech, mixed with TJ Sanders and Tonka Hemingway is big for that defense. And I think they got some nice players in the secondary as well, including Jalen Kilgore and Nick Morney. 5-7 for me for South Carolina. It's going to be it for today's episode. As always, Nick, appreciate you joining me doing our deep dive here on the SEC. A great conference as always. We haven't completed the other conferences, so we're not sure how many teams from the SEC will end up in the playoffs. Looks like 4 is a safe bet, Nick. I'd probably put, maybe 4.5 is the total on that. There's a lot of good teams here. Obviously, we have 5 of them claiming double-digit victories, and of course, I have Georgia winning the conference championship over Alabama in the rematch. You have Bama staying 2-0 though, flawless against Georgia on the season. I think this is gonna be a great year for this conference. Very excited to see what we get right and what we get wrong. Gonna be it for today's episode. As always, make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.